Okay, we are about to have a session on cyber norms. This is an interactive session, so I will encourage you to have, we're sort of trying to get this a little bit rapid fire, and yeah, get some engagement around an interesting issue. So I'm going to introduce you to Johanna, who is Australia's rep to the cyber norms.
Yeah, sure.
Is that right? I didn't write that down at all. Johanna will introduce herself to you.
Brilliant. I love being the rep to the cyber norm. Hi, so I'm Johanna Weaver. I work at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, so I'm one of those evil public servants you've all been talking about, who is an international lawyer, which is great as well. Folks, I'm here today to talk to you about cyber norms, or actually more to pick your brains about cyber norms, from the perspective of what it is that states should be doing and should not be doing in cyberspace. So there are lots of different types of norms. My focus, I work at DFAT, unsurprisingly, is looking at what countries should and shouldn't be doing. This session is going to be interactive, but we thought it would be useful just to frame the conversation in terms of what has happened, what have we actually done already, and what are we looking to do through these two conversations that will be that have kicked off at the UN last month. So what we're going to do is a short video. It's 1 minute. This is the world premiere of this video, which we've worked on very closely. Yeah, exactly. There's nothing worse than the cyber experts. Cyber's not working, and this is just setting the scene.
To promote stability, the members of the United Nations have developed a framework that clearly articulates what states should and should not do in cyberspace. This framework for responsible state behaviour has 4 pillars. The first is that international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, applies to state conduct in cyberspace. Next are 11 agreed norms which set clear expectations of responsible state behaviour during peacetime. Those norms are supported by confidence-building measures which strengthen transparency, predictability and stability. The last pillar is cyber capacity building to ensure all states can harness the benefits and mitigate the risks of increased connectivity. All 193 UN member states have endorsed this framework, including in UN General Assembly Resolution 70237. Want more information? Visit un.org/disarmament/ICT-security or dfat.gov.au/cyberaffairs.
So the point of that video is really to set the scene. So despite the fact that many people, particularly when you're talking about what it is that countries are doing in cyberspace, use phrases like the Wild West, international, there is no law, the survival of the fittest, it's fundamentally untrue. So we have, as a group of countries at the United Nations, agreed that when countries are acting in cyberspace, the same rules that govern with their activities in the physical world govern the way that they should interact in cyberspace. And it's really reflective of some of the comments that the last panel were making, actually, in terms of this online real world. So the discussions that are happening at the UN, there's 2 discussions. There's one which is 193 countries, so all of the countries of the United Nations, and then there's another which is 25 countries, which is selected based on equal geographical distribution. Australia is a member of both of those UN groups. And what we're really hoping the next step in the UN groups will be looking at, okay, it's fine if countries have agreed that international law applies. It's fine if they've agreed norms of responsible state behaviour, but clearly countries are acting or are violating these agreements and acting in a way that is inconsistent with what we have agreed at the UN. So the next step, what we really want to be focusing on, is how do we make sure that countries are actually implementing these agreements, that are actually putting into practice, walking the talk, walking the walk, if you like, rather than just talking the talk. So what I would like the interactive session today to be about is looking at, we're hoping these groups will drill down into providing best practice advice for governments on implementations of the norms of responsible state behaviour. So we're talking here about what it is that governments should be doing, but in many instances, what governments do affects everyone in this room. In many instances, governments will outsource the implementation of these types of activities to industry, and of course industry owns and operates much of the infrastructure that we're talking about and providing this best practice advice on. So much of the expertise that will come towards implementation will actually come from many of the people in this room. So before we throw over to seeking your views on what you think would be best practice implementation for governments on the implementation of the norms, we have a short video which just goes through what are these 11 norms. These are the 11 norms that have all been agreed by every country at the United Nations in terms of what states should and shouldn't be doing in cyberspace. So as it plays, just keep in mind in your head, there'll be a norm in there that will trigger your interest. As we were saying before, there is a norm for everybody here. And what I'm looking for is your suggestions to government on how we should be implementing those norms. Johanna, do you need a scribe? We have scribes for the next session, yes, for the next bit. I believe we have scribes.
Do we have scribes? I was butcher paper scribe, but I think
You have 2 minutes. The video runs for 1 minute and 54 seconds.
Norms are one component of the United Nations Framework for Responsible State Behaviour in Cyberspace. The framework's 11 peacetime norms that were adopted in 2015 set out 8 positive steps that states should take and 3 actions states should avoid. The 8 positive norms are cooperating to increase stability and security in cyberspace, considering all relevant information in the case of cyber incidents, preventing criminal and terrorist use of information and communications technologies, respecting human rights, including privacy, online, taking appropriate measures to protect critical infrastructure from cyber threats, responding to reasonable requests for assistance from another state, taking steps to protect the integrity of supply chains for ICT products, and reporting ICT vulnerabilities in a responsible manner. The norms also list activities that states should refrain from. They are not knowingly allowing territory to be used to commit internationally wrongful acts using cyber tools, not conducting cyber activities that damage the critical infrastructure of another country, not harming another country's computer emergency response team or using a computer emergency response team to engage in malicious cyber activity. All 193 UN member states have endorsed these norms, including in UN General Assembly Resolution 70-237. Want more information? Visit un.org/disarmament/ICT-security or dfat.gov.au/cyberaffairs.
Okay, so folks, this is really what we hope will be the beginning of a conversation. I am Australia's representative. Someone's shaking their head vigorously at me from the audience. I am, I promise, I really am Australia's representative. So this is the start of a conversation. We have 20 minutes to do this, but I would also encourage all of you, if you're interested in this subject, if you follow my Twitter account, _Johanna.Weaver, there'll be plenty of opportunities for consultations. We'll be putting out a public call for consultations, and there's also consultations happening at the UN in December as well. For those of you who were here promised that we would have a throwing microphone, I was brought here on the promise that we would have a microphone that we could throw. We don't have a microphone that we can throw. So instead, I'm going to throw this tissue box at the first person who would like to make a suggestion. And then whoever makes the suggestion, if you then throw the tissue box to the next person. Oh, we've got an AP Nick something running down the floor. Yay! AP Nick saves the day once again. Brilliant. Yeah. Does it work? Hello? Hello? Well, anyway, if it doesn't work, we'll send a microphone. In any event, we're going to throw this round. So what I'm looking for is suggestions from you in terms of implementation from those 11 norms of responsible state behaviour. Who would like to go first? Whilst you're getting brave, I'd also like to do a shout out to Bart from ASPI, who was responsible for the design of all of those nifty icons that sit behind those pictures. So thank you to Bart for all of his hard work on that. Okay, I'm a terrible throw, but let's go.
Does this work? Yes. Yay! My best practice is related to the cooperation. My best practice is don't reinvent the wheel, use existing processes. Just because it's digital doesn't mean that you can't use existing processes that are other related to security out there. I can't throw that fast. It's going to be hard.
My concern about 9 out of the 10 are all about security. We've just had a couple of discussions back in the security panel to say we actually should rethink security. We need to locate security in terms of personal instead of state. And the second one, the lawyers will understand when I say, unless you make it domestic law, it's not real. We've been calling for a human rights charter that is something enshrined in domestic law. So let's actually start with domestic law to protect human rights, because we don't have it in this country. We have it in the States, Victoria and ACT. We don't have it here. All right, next. Oh, we're going to have to...
Just one quick comment, which is on point number 1, interstate cooperation on security. It won't work without other stakeholders being involved. It's a waste of time if you don't involve all stakeholders.
That's why I'm
here. You don't know how to do it. Next.
So tell me how to do it. That's what I'm looking for. I'm actually genuinely seeking your input and advice. Don't tell me that I'm crap at it. Tell me what I need to do to be better. Okay, great. That's why I'm here.
This kind of builds on the idea of building more stakeholders. We've worked quite a bit with the emergency response community. So obviously, number 11 is a very important norm to us. But one of the challenges, and this is a discussion happening at FIRST, which is the global organization that involves a lot of the incident response teams, is what does it mean to be an emergency response team? They're talking about potential code of ethics. We're seeing a lot of trends in the region where certs are becoming part of national cybersecurity centers that sometimes involve, some police functions or some intelligence functions in these other areas. So working with industry and promoting that industry conversation that's happening, getting involved in that industry conversation to make sure that there's more depth underneath the definitions of emergency response teams, and also some of the other areas like critical infrastructure or human rights and privacy, just engaging to give meat to these high-level kind of concepts.
Absolutely. And if you have any suggestions on how you think we should be defining the critical, the incident response people, I'd welcome that.
I'd like to respond in relation to number 8, respond to requests for assistance, presumably from international bodies. I'd like to see the equivalent of a Cloud Act from the US implemented in Australia, and that gives protection to Australian bodies that disclose information to foreign law enforcement, because at the moment, obviously, there's issues around the Telecoms Act and privacy, etc.
Well, you'll be happy to know that Australia and the US have just commenced negotiations on a Cloud Act treaty.
It's also excellent that the assistance and access legislation makes that non-compatible. The point that I would like to make is with respect to 5 and 6. The Human Rights Commissioner in Australia, appreciating the comment over there, which I think is the most important aspect, we don't have human rights legislation in Australia, so until that happens, this is redundant. The discussion paper that the Human Rights Commissioner has in Electronic Frontiers and a number of other civil society submissions was, to have sustainable technology, you also have to deal with the creation and destruction of critical infrastructure and the way in which we have an environmentally friendly way of storing data and then using that data. To respect human rights and privacy, or the human rights like the ability not to be subjected to slavery or third world conditions as a consequence of the exploitation of resources to be used in technology, and then saying you can't damage critical infrastructure, kind of doesn't come at the same odds. I think this has to be a broader picture where all of society is being addressed in this, not just it's about technology. The humans have to be brought into this discussion as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And to take the point on human rights, so what we're looking at here is what it is that countries are doing to each other in cyberspace, which obviously has very direct impacts on human rights. The human rights bodies that we're looking at in this context are things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's looking at something that all countries, all states have subscribed to and saying, at very minimum, this is what we should be protecting online. And it's looking at the reality of the environment that we're working with, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a very good start in that sense. And it's also looking at what it is that countries are doing to each other rather than what it is that countries are doing to individuals, which would be another thing that distinguishes it. I'm absolutely not saying that Australia's own human rights protections are not something that we need to be having a close look at, but it's not necessarily when we say protection of human rights, the Australian regime, we're looking at what is that on a global scale.
Sorry, one more then. As an aspect of those human rights is the right to enforce intellectual property. So when we're talking about this critical infrastructure and we're talking about the way in which information systems are preserved, there's been discussions today about the way in which we understand the meaning behind decision making. So giving open access to decision making. The mention was made before to Wisconsin and Loomis and the decision that had the Compass platform in question. Will this include recommendations that technologies or security structures that are used in law enforcement are made available in terms of the decision-making specification and source data?
It's not something that is currently included, but it is something, for example, that could fit under the norm number 4, and it's something that if you think we should be including that, I would invite you to provide some information and detail to me on it, and I'm happy to consider that as something that we can take forward. This really is me asking you to tell me what you think is important in this piece, so that as I'm formulating Australia's positions.
Incoming. Look, I'm not sure if this is exactly in scope because we're talking about interstate issues happening here. But in a time of crisis, a state is likely to undertake actions in its own jurisdiction, such as shutdowns, and those shutdowns can actually cause problems to critical infrastructure. They can harm emergency response teams' actions. They can interfere with human rights and so forth. So I'm just wondering, it's more a question, is do shutdowns enter into this at all, as in a country undertaking its own shutdown of its own infrastructure in a context where in a situation where these things might be applying?
Yeah, I can certainly see circumstances where it might, in the sense that if you have a interstate conflict and as a result of that, a state attempted to shut down the internet of another state, or internal dissent, and that would really all fall under explanation and implementation of the norm on protection of human rights. And this is where I come back to, it's not saying that Australia's domestic human rights regime isn't very important, but it's also looking at what does this mean on a global scale, and perhaps what guidance we can provide under that norm, in terms of, okay, it may be in some instances, in some very, very extreme, extraordinary circumstances, it may be legitimate, possibly, I'm being hypothetical, speaking in a hypothetical fashion here, that it might be possible to shut down an internet, but what would the circumstances in which that would be legitimate? You'd need to do it in a human rights compliant manner. I was specifically
wondering about a country shutting down its own internet, for reasons of protecting its own vulnerability, and having the side effects that actually do result in some of these harms to their own infrastructure. And is that in scope or not?
Yeah, so it is in scope, and if you have a look at the reports, and for anyone who's got the little booklets that we've been handing out, you'll notice that there's quite a lot of references, for example, to state sovereignty. Anywhere you have a reference to state sovereignty, it will usually be accompanied by a reference to human rights. And part of that is looking at, okay, so a state has the ability to extend its sovereignty over its borders, to the internet within its borders, but we all as countries have an obligation to comply with our human rights obligations, for example, as those under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So shutdowns is not written in the text, but certainly there would be scope potentially for it to be if people feel that that is important.
Could I pass this to Keith?
Never could catch. It's a trap when you get up from these chairs.
Extraordinarily graceful.
I know. God. Ask me to do that again and I won't. Mine is a variation on the previous question. In looking at the things which states are asked not to do, clearly there will be many circumstances where, dare I say it, the larger and more powerful nations will derogate from these norms. Does the collection of agreements that have been developed so far encompass the circumstances under which derogations would be allowable, or the limits within which they might be posited? And for example, do no damage to critical infrastructure. We can think of dozens of examples where assorted nation states have deliberately attacked each other's critical infrastructure in the absence of any declaration of war. So I guess my question is there work going on to articulate what might be more or less defensible derogations?
So in terms of, three comments. One, norms are one element of the four of the framework. So norms don't replace international law or your international legal obligations, including the obligations under the UN Charter. So they are an extension, if you like. They help to translate the existing international law into a digital environment. Second, absolutely, there are some countries that are continuing to violate these agreements. And Australia, like many other countries, is particularly concerned about that. So the other side of the coin to the work that we're doing at the United Nations is also work to call out that bad behaviour, to call out and to respond to that, which is a large body of work that is ongoing. In terms of specific legal derogations, we haven't got to that point yet, but it is in terms of further clarity on what we mean by this, which then makes it harder for countries to be able to say, oh, but I didn't understand.
There was one element that I was looking for in here and I haven't found it yet. In a previous session, we were asking the question, what useful things could government do so that we don't always just complain about them not doing things? One of the things are to adopt appropriate stimulatory and regulatory approaches in order to encourage IT providers to deliver secure goods and services, and to encourage user organisations to apply such goods and services. Yeah. Is that within scope?
It is within scope, and it is actually already almost there. So this video is a summary of what the norms are, but if you have a look at number 9, ensure supply chain security, that norm, so it does, for example, cover ICT vulnerabilities, supply chain, and looking at how you build and make secure products. So your comment could be included, for example, as an explanatory or further extension of that norm there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to, oh God, I've got a bad shoulder. I don't know if I can bowl with that power anymore.
Thank you. I have been wondering a lot in the last few years about the relationship between this cyber norm process that has been mostly held in closed doors in the first committee of the UN. It's a process that has taken very strong and very geopolitical points of views between subset of UN, it's not a lot, a subset of governmental experts. And obviously the internet governance tradition has almost the same age. It has been mostly discussed in another part of the UN, which has been a little bit more open back from the days of the World Summit on the Information Society. And I always wonder, I mean, what's the governance process to develop cyber norms, and what's the governance process to implement or operationalize all these norms? And usually all these norms are sort of product of a long set of negotiations that when you read the text, it just doesn't make much sense. And particularly for us in the technical environment, when you get into how do you operationalize this, how can you ground these into sort of the transmission of packets between networks? Because ultimately, some of these operationalizations, if you really take them as, okay, let's respect these norms, what does that mean? Then how would you do that at the network operational level? And from my point of view, this is very much within an internet governance process because it should require, and I think there is much opportunity for these processes to learn about this other side that has been much more open in terms of technical expertise right from the development of these cyber norms or the future of their operationalization. I will leave it there.
All right, I'm going to answer those 3 points very quickly. So how are they developed? Yes, they are developed by negotiation by states, and they have been negotiated behind closed doors until now. This year, however, the conversations are happening in the 193 country United Nations Forum. They're webcast, so anyone is able to participate or anyone is able to see the discussions. And there's also consultations.
Just very recently, but I cannot see the webcast of the first reports and how those reports were negotiated. There are no transcripts, there are no documents. You cannot see the inputs of what have been the positions of many of the governmental experts in that. So I don't think this is just opening up after 15 years. And my question here is, well, if it is opening up, I think there is a lot to catch up from open internet governance processes, and there would be a very good opportunities if these governmental experts and these political processes decide that this would be a good thing. And I think
so we are, is my answer. So we are. We have open-ended consultations happening in New York, which are open to everybody. I appreciate the fact that they haven't been open till now, and that's just the reality. These are political negotiations between countries that happen. We can't change what has happened in the past, but I can tell you that as Australia's representative going into the next round of negotiations, I am very eager to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to input into these conversations and to provide me with the benefit of your expertise so that we can go in and be as constructive as we possibly can. Now, of course, once I get into the room, I am negotiating in an environment with many countries who don't share my view and who don't necessarily want there to be a wide range of multi-stakeholder participants in the room. And that's the reality that we're dealing with. But I can tell you, I am committed to doing that for Australia's positions.
Well, the rest will be very hard. But
well, it will, but we have to deal with the reality and the world we're living in, and we still have the ability to make progress. All right, we've got one last comment.
Okay, I'll try to make it quick. Critical infrastructure, I think the definition of that is quite important. In Australia, my understanding is that current legislation defines critical infrastructure as the government is critical infrastructure. The opposition is not.
I'd love to see where that definition is, because as far as I'm aware, the Australian government doesn't define critical infrastructure. We have critical infrastructure legislation that came out in 2018, which for the first time listed a certain number of sectors that are called critical infrastructure, so our ports, our airports, our water and power.
Yep.
But I certainly don't know of anything that has government or not.
So the question there is, are voting institutions or governance and electoral institutions counted as critical infrastructure?
Yeah.
And to what level does that mean? Does that mean the ability, for example, we have an independent AEC, is it just that? what about minor political parties? Is their infrastructure counted as part of critical infrastructure?
Sure. So the definition of critical infrastructure doesn't appear in these documents, people often come to me with frustrations about, well, what does the interpretation of this document mean? What does, different countries will have different interpretations of particular parts, and in many instances that is deliberate, right? It is part of the negotiating strategy to get agreement on a document, and then the next step is to say, okay, what do we mean by that? We're now at that point where we're saying, what do we mean by that? And I want to go into the room as prepared as we can with the most constructive inputs that we have. So that definition of critical infrastructure is one that regularly comes up. Okay.
Can I just drill down a little bit more on that? Because I actually thought, given I work in telco engineering, that we did have pretty solid definitions around what critical infrastructure was, because I'm pretty sure I've had to look at lists and things, and I thought .au was, the infrastructure behind .au was part of our critical infrastructure.
So
now.
we have many
we
have many things that are critical infrastructure in Australia, but we don't have one list that says this is what Australia's critical infrastructure is. We define what critical infrastructure is. We define systems of national infrastructure. The Australian government has probably got that list. It's not the department that I work in.
You mean the
but we don't
department
make that list
implies
public.
in the strongest possible terms that this is what it is and you will comply. Yeah, I get it now.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay.
I'm
I'm being liberal because we started 5 minutes late, so we're going to finish 5 minutes later. Yeah.
I'll be brief, but look, I'm not sure if this falls under number 5, but the right to freedom of speech and political discourse. If we're looking on a global level, and that's probably something we need to consider.
Yeah. And so what I would encourage for people who are going to engage in terms of the submissions and things is when we're making our inputs in the room, I'm making inputs in a room that have 193 countries, or that have 23 countries, which include the permanent 5. So China, Russia, US, France, and, my gosh, Britain, thank you. Thanks, Jill. Yeah. So if I'm to get agreement to text, all of those countries have to agree to it, because that's what happens in these negotiations. It's consensus text. So everyone in the room, not dissimilar to how these kind of communities work, everyone in the room has to agree to that text. So yes, but what is it that is in the framing of that can help me get it across the line in the context of all of the other countries in the room?
Sure.
All right. Yes, please.
Not good for the shoulder. Okay. Silvia Cadena here. What if you could put them back on? Can you put the image back on? One thing that I personally think would be very important in the context of how interstate cooperation and security and how you cooperate to stop crime and terrorism and all the rest is that you can do it on an equal footing, right? So there are developing countries that do not have necessarily the capacity, the resources, the funding, not only to deal, for example, with the cybersecurity incidents, right? But to actually flesh out a proper emergency response team and keep it running for a number of years, right? You are aware of the efforts that APNIC has been doing to support CSERTs in the Pacific, for example. But I think it's really important to put it out there that it's not only the internet is as stable, as reliable, as secure, and as everything else as the engineers that are doing it, right? So if none of this takes into consideration the recruitment and staff retention elements to make sure that there are actually people making these things happen and making good decisions, then a lot of this probably will not work. So I think that although it's not considered there, it's something around the funding that needs to go along with training, capacity building will be something of very, maybe that 12 box that is not there is about, how that commitment to actually make it happen. And for that, you need resources and talent.
Absolutely. So if you remember from the first video I showed, there was 4 elements to the framework of what's been agreed at the United Nations. So it's international law, norms, confidence building measures, and capacity building. So capacity building is absolutely a huge part. Australia is one of the largest donors in this area, and it's a real priority. And one of the things we're hoping will come out of these UN processes is better matching of the better understanding of the needs of the countries that require capacity building and better matching of them to donors, because there's a lot of funding in this area, but I certainly am not convinced that that funding is necessarily getting to the right countries in the right places. So we hope that that will be one of the things. It doesn't show here because it comes under a different pillar. The gentleman at the back, and then we're going to finish.
All right, so my question was about regarding norm number 10. I was wondering, because many security government agencies require those vulnerabilities to do their job. So I was wondering whether such agencies were within the scope of that norm.
They absolutely are. So everything that I do at the United Nations is in lockstep with all of the Australian government agencies that are involved in this. And for people who are interested in the ICT vulnerabilities, from ASD have just published their responsible reporting of ICT vulnerabilities. It's available on their website, and that sets out the Australian government policy in terms of how we report ICT vulnerabilities. All right, guys, we're going to wrap it up there. But as I said, this is really just a taster. Many of the comments, many of the frustrations in the room are comments and frustrations that I would love to hear more about in terms of what is it that you think we should be seeing as outputs out of this process. Please feel free to grab me in the break or to, as I said, follow the Twitter account, and there'll be lots of advice in terms of how you can engage and provide your inputs. If you are providing inputs, I really encourage you to make them very specific inputs in terms of what you want to see in terms of the reports and advice and best practice implementation. And I really look forward to receiving your advice and guidance and collectively sucking up all of the expertise in the room. Thank you very much.